Welcome to this next part of this class on Spanish nationalism in Spain. And here we're going to talk about Catalonia, and we're going to talk about Catalan nationalism. What I'm going to do is a small overview of the history of Catalan nationalism, and then we're going to address what is actually happening now in Catalonia. This is a very controversial issue, particularly what is happening right now. So if you have any questions, once again, please just write any kind of comment under the video, or send me an email, or even if you want me to further elaborate on this, I'll be willing to expand on this issue and tell you more about it and in more detail, and do it in more than one video. If you're really interested on this issue, I'll be more than happy to do so. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Catalan nationalism, and for that we're going to use, what I'm going to use is the book of one Spanish historian, Professor José Álvarez of Universidad Complutense, that he wrote Mar per Dolorosa in 2001, and 2001 is going to be interesting because this is before all this pro-independence wave got traction in Catalonia. And it talks about the history of Catalan nationalism and where does it start. So we can go 1,000 years ago to start talking about some kind of identity, but remember that nationalism is rather new. It only got traction in the 18th century with the French Revolution. Before that, there were identities, but there was no meaning given to those identities. And there was no such a collective identity that people in a society could identify themselves as part of them. During the 18th century in Catalonia, we can talk about double patriotism. Double patriotism, why? Because on the one hand, we had attachment to cultural traits. The cultural dimension of nationalism was present in Catalonia. But on the other hand, if we read works of the time, we see that they embrace Spanish political identity. So the political dimension, the liberal dimension of nationalism was still mainly Spanish. There was no idea of a Catalan state independent from Spain whatsoever. This starts changing in 1873, 1874. That year and a half in Spain, is the first time that Spain becomes a republic. It was a failure of a federal state in Spain, but at that time we start talking about the possibility of Catalonia being independent, having political identity beyond that cultural identity that they had. We know how in the Second Republic they got to have self-governing institutions. At the beginning of the 20th century already, at that time, they do get some support. The nationalist parties in Catalonia, like Lliga Regionalista, Lluís Companys, and that later was the first president of the Generalitat during the Second Republic. Don't worry too much about that. And then how Francoism comes, and that kind of political expression of the nationalism is neglected and is repressed. And we have political repression. There were no political parties beyond the Francoist one, the Falange, and also cultural repression because there was no way that people could speak Catalan in the streets or any kind of administration. So they were culturally neglected. Traditions as a diada, there was a demonstration for the Catalans to the Catalan national pride, so to say, was suspended, etc., etc. Obviously, that changed with the democracy, that changed after the transition, when Catalonia has its own self-governing institutions. And it seemed that was a good fit, as for example was the case in the Basque Country with PNV. At least that was the case up until 2010. And we'll see that changed. Before 2006, as we were saying, there was perfect cohabitation. So more or less that kind of dual patriotism that we had back at the beginning of Catalan nationalism. Same thing happened during those stages of the democracy. However, 2006, Catalonia reforms its Estatut d'Autonomia. Remember that we talked about these charters in the last class, and Catalonia reforms it. It's approved by the Catalan Parliament, by the Spanish Congreso de los Diputados, and is voted by the Catalan people in a referendum. But in 2010, the Constitutional Court fined several of the articles in this new statute to be against the constitution. And we mentioned it in the previous class, and we talked about some regarding to language and Catalan being predominant over Spanish in Catalonia, some about taxes and taking ownership, taking sovereignty over some taxing systems in Catalonia, and also the government of justice in Catalonia will be independent. And the Constitutional Court found this to be against the Constitution, despite the Spanish courts, the Spanish Congress, the Catalan Parliament, and the people voted for it. But the Constitutional Court is over all this because it's our Constitution is on top of this hierarchy of norms. And what happened is that this constitutional ruling caused a turmoil in Catalonia. And as I was saying, they understood that their political identity was Spanish and not Catalan, and the Catalan project was under the Spanish project itself. And this triggered a pro-independence movement. Obviously, this gained traction over time, and this has resulted in what you're probably seeing on the news: thousands of people demonstrating in Catalonia for independence, and also Catalan politicians in jail because of calling an illegal referendum. As you remember from last class, referendums, it's only only the central state can call referendums. It's a competence of the central state. That was the word I was looking for. So where are we at the moment? We have a political conflict because actually the support for independence in Catalonia is not massive. If 80% of Catalan people want to be independent, have no doubt that Catalonia will be independent tomorrow. The problem here is that less than 50% of the people vote for pro-independence parties, and posing now such a question will create a rupture between society in Catalonia, and this might be problematic. But at least this is a little bit of some hints on what's going on in Catalonia. And obviously, right now with coronavirus, the only interesting thing is that this is not an issue in Spanish news anymore. But before coronavirus, it was every single day on Spanish news and deeply affected Spanish politics. Okay, this was all about this class. If you have any question, please email me. Remember, for next week, watch the movie and do the assignment. Is due on Wednesday. Okay, if you have any doubt about it as well, please email me. All the best. See ya.